be out here with you. Been out here before and enjoy it each time that I'm here. We have, of course, a family connection, and I'm the most senior of the David Chamberlins, and then there's a few others that come along behind all of that. We have Barbara Ann is my wife, and we have 10 grandchildren, and we have 20 great-grandchildren, and there's another one on the way, so it's going to be 21 later this month. So we're sort of floating in children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, but they're all lovely, lovely children, except this one. He's
Yep, there's an upside. Yeah.
He keeps growing. They keep feeding him. You know, he's going to be taller than everybody. We're in the book of Daniel. If you've got your Bibles with you, hopefully that you do have your Bibles with you, because we're going to cover Daniel in 4 sessions. We'll probably try to work in 3 chapters each session, and I'll give you a break at the end of the first hour, and so you can get some refreshment or use the facilities or whatever. Daniel is interesting writing in that as a major prophet, he covers what's covered in the book of Daniel. Of course, in the English version, is worked out to be 12 chapters. The 11th chapter is a very difficult chapter for liberal scholarship. They don't like it. And the reason they don't like it is because it is so accurate in noting 2 families who are Greek families. One is the Ptolemy family and the other is the Seleucid family. And they're very real families. They're very, very real families in the history book. Alexander the Great, when he was on his deathbed, was asked this question: to whom does the kingdom belong? And being the wily individual that he is, he said, to the strongest. Well, he had his 5 generals standing around him when he said that, so you can imagine what they did. They went out and divided the kingdom all up, and then they couldn't get along with one another. There was no common enemy to fight except for each other. It worked out where there actually eventually just became 4 generals that took over the empire, and 2 of those generals, Seleucus and Ptolemy, were the 2 generals. One, Ptolemy, was in Egypt, and Seleucus was in the rest of the Greek world. Well, not actually the whole of the Greek world, because there are 2 other generals, but they're briefly noted in the book of Daniel. But the other 2 in chapter 11 are noted in great detail. Seleucus and Ptolemy, those 2 families, and they do not get along with one another, and they continue to fight one another until an individual by the name of C. Popilius Laenas, who was a Roman envoy who just happened to be in the area at the time when Antiochus IV, or known as Antiochus Epiphanes, decided he'd raid Egypt one more time. He'd already done it twice and been very successful. And so he comes into the land, and this Roman envoy, along with a number of lictors, those are individuals of authority who are with him. They usually carry a bundle of rods to show their authority. And if those rods don't have an axe in them, then they have the authority to beat people. If the bundle of rods has an axe in it, then they have the authority to kill. Well, this was all a big bluff. And C. Popilius Laenas said to Antiochus IV, you got a choice. I'm going to draw a circle around you in the sand. This was in Alexandria, North Africa. I'm going to draw a circle around you in the sand, and you have a choice to make. You can choose to either step out of the circle and take your army and go home, or you can stay here and die. That's your choice. He had no Roman legion with him. He just had the authority of Rome. And it was really sort of a big bluff, and it worked. Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, said, I'm out of here. He took his army. He retreated back home, which would be up in the area of Syria. And on his way through Jerusalem, he took a pig and sacrificed it on the altar and desecrated the temple. And all of that is noted in detail in the book of Daniel. And all of this is written down by Daniel long before it takes place. And so you have a little bit of Roman interference, and you have a lot of Greek interference in the beautiful land, the promised land. And that's what Daniel notes. Now, as you're looking at the Bible, you remember that in studying it in Bible class, that the teacher probably said to you, now when we get down here to the post-exilic prophets, which would be Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, when we cover those, then there's going to be a long period of silence. God's not going to say anything until the New Testament comes along. And that's true as we find the written word. However, there's all sorts of material that God has revealed prior to the book of Malachi. And so really there's lots of blank spaces that are filled in. And so when we're talking about the Romans and we're talking about the Greeks, that information is given, and most of it's given in the book of Daniel. So when we're looking at chapters 1 through 3, and especially when we get to chapter 2, we're going to find an image, we're going to find a statue, and we're going to find out that that statue represents a number of nations that are no longer with us. It starts out with the Babylonian, with Nebuchadnezzar, and he is the head. And then we come down to the Persian, which would be individuals like Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, who comes along and releases the children of Israel from Babylonian captivity because the Persians have taken over from the Babylonian Empire. And then we come down on the statue to the next portion, the lower portion, which is going to be the Greek portion. And then finally we come down to the legs and the feet, and that's all Roman. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to have you turn over to Daniel 2, because I want you to see in Daniel 2, and then we'll come back and look at some of the slides about all of this material. Looking at Daniel 2, and this is the dream. And you remember that Nebuchadnezzar has told all of his wise men, you have to tell me the dream and then the interpretation. And if the dream lines up with what I have seen in the dream, then you're okay. If not, you're in a world of hurt. And they can't do it. And so looking at this dream, look at Daniel, the second chapter. It says, now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. From this point on, from chapter 2, verse 4, the latter part of verse 4, all the way down to chapter 7 and verse 8, or verse 28 rather, it is written in a different language. It's written in Aramaic. Now the Aramaic language is very similar to the Hebrew language. They both use the same alphabet, but the words are different. For instance, when you're looking at the word sun, The word son can be either ben or bar. One is Hebrew, one is Aramaic. And the similarities are found throughout both languages. However, Denny Petrillo, who's been out here, who's got a great deal of knowledge concerning the use of the Hebrew, was given at one time an Aramaic text and asked if he could translate it, and he looked at it and said, no, I can't translate it. So it's enough, there's enough difference that people cannot easily move from one to the other. But the Aramaic language is the language of the Babylonian Empire. It's also the language of the Assyrian Empire. It's also the language of the Syrian. So you have Assyrian, Syrian, and Babylonian all are dealing with the Aramaic language. And so that's why in Daniel, since you're dealing with Babylonians right here, Nebuchadnezzar, you're dealing with the Aramaic language. But the translation is good, and so we just continue on in the English version, and we don't have really any great difficulty. So the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, verse 4, said, O king, live forever. They're politically correct. That's the right thing to say to somebody like Nebuchadnezzar. These kings, by the way, are very despotic, generally. If they get up on the wrong side of the bed, they'll do you in. If they get up on what they consider the right side of the bed, they may give you all sorts of riches. And you never know exactly what you're up against when you're up against any one of these kings. You'll find in the book of Esther, for instance, her husband is Xerxes, or Ahasuerus by name. He's noted as Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. The Greeks knew him as Xerxes the Great. He's the one whose forces got held up by Greek forces and 300 Spartans at a battle called the place of hot gates, Thermopylae, and finally got through and went in and burned Athens, and then lost a sea battle, and the sea battle of Salamis there in the harbor. And so Xerxes went back with his great army back into Persia, whipped, and it's that time, right in that time period, that Esther appears on the scene, and I suppose she's a great comfort to Xerxes, and that's the connection we have with Xerxes. But the Babylonians are taken over by the Persians, and the Persians are taken over by the Greeks, and the Greeks are taken over by the Romans. And you say, yeah, but what does that have to do with Daniel? Well, I'm going to show you what it has to do with Daniel. It's right here. Just take a look. So the king, the Chaldeans spoke to the king. King answered and said to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. This is verse 5 of chapter 2. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be, here's a world of hurt. You will be torn limb from limb, and your house will be made a rubbish heap. In other words, you're going to be killed, and your family is too, and there won't be any sign that you ever existed, because we're going to scrape your house clean. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. They're rather insistent because it's their only hope. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time. Well, these kings, not only being despotic, generally they were not very well educated. And the reason they weren't, they had people to do that for them. And so if they had any reading to do, somebody would read it for them. If they had any writing to do, somebody would do the writing. So they really were very much that way. Not all of them, but most of them were really not educated. And so, but he's pretty smart. And he says, if I know the dream, then I'll know the interpretation. He's had dealings with these fellows before. We don't see it anywhere in the book of Daniel or in Scripture. But he's had dealings with these fellows before, and they told him whatever came to mind. And he said, well, but if they tell if they have to tell him the dream, then he knows the interpretation is going to be correct. I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you, for you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth. Now they're really running off at the mouth, and they should have stopped. Because now they're going to put Daniel in a position that when he does what he does, he's going to be fantastically idolized almost. Because they say there's not a man on earth. Well, what happens when Daniel comes along and does it? Who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Chaldeans are noted here as a separate people, and they really are a separate people. They are really at the southern end or at the northern end of the Persian Gulf, as you look at the Tigris and Euphrates rivers coming down through that Mesopotamia and flowing into the Persian Gulf, and they live down in that area. They're seen right here as a wise people. Verse 11, moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except gods. Whoops. Now, what happens when Daniel comes along? Whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Oh, just keep building up. His resume is going to look great, when he finally does what he does. Because of this, the king became indignant, yes, and very furious. Oh, you don't want to be around these guys like this. Remember, and I was about to note in the time of Esther, Xerxes, and you remember Haman, and that Haman is the one who wants to kill all the Jews just so he can kill Mordecai. And Xerxes, when he finds out what Haman has done, he has to go out of the room because his anger is just boiling over. And that's not unusual among these kings. So he gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. They looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he answered and said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter, so Daniel went in, requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, about the matter. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their names will be changed to Babylonian-sounding names because their names at this particular point, like most Hebrew names, give honor to God. Anytime you find an AH ending to a man's name or an EL ending to a man's name in the Hebrew, that means God is part of that individual's name. So Daniel, Dan means judge. Daniel means God has judged, because the EL ending is a shortened form of Elohim, and Elohim is one of the Hebrew words that's used for God. And so Daniel. And so you can look at Jeremiah, the AH ending is going to bring God into the meaning of the name. And so the names have been changed by the Babylonians because they don't like giving honor every time they open up their mouth to address one of these guys. They don't like giving honor to a Hebrew god. They want to give honor to their Babylonian gods. And we're not sure exactly. We think we know at least one of the names that gives honor to one of the Babylonian gods. But right here, they're just noted as the three friends, and they're noted by name: Hananiah, there's the AH ending. Mishael, there's the EL ending. And Azariah, there's the AH ending again. So those names all give honor to God. And they have already been changed. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in the night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven seemingly after the mystery is revealed. Daniel answered and said, "Let the name of the God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men, knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To thee, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for thou hast given me wisdom and power. Even now thou hast made known to me what we requested." So the three friends are a part and parcel of this prayer. "What we have requested of thee, for thou hast made known to us the king's matter." Therefore Daniel went into Arioch. Arioch is the one who was the captain of the king's bodyguard, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went in and spoke to them as follows: "Do not destroy the wise men." Now that's very magnanimous of Daniel, because these guys are going to try to do him in later on. And he starts out by saying, "Spare them." That's just his character. That's the kind of person he is. "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence. I will declare the interpretation to the king." Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king." And he goes on and notes all of this. But I want you to come down here to verse 30. He says, "But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than in any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. You, O king," here he goes. Here he's telling him what the dream is. "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome." Well, Daniel is writing, if you look up on the screen, Daniel is writing where God rules the nations. If any one single writing notes God ruling the nations, then this is it. Now keep in mind, when I say God rules the nations, that God is powerless in certain aspects. God cannot make you do something you don't want to do. He's given you free moral choice. He's given every man and woman free moral choice. And you can decide that you don't want to obey God, or you can decide you want to obey God. So when we look at the power of God being, where it notes that he's all-powerful, you need to understand that his being all-powerful, that he is limited right here at this particular point, because he will not and cannot deny one their free moral choice. And so keeping that in mind when we talk about God rules the nations, and that would be in the building up of the nation and the bringing down of the nation. God rules the nations. And that's noted, easily noted, because none of you have any Babylonian neighbors. None of you have any Assyrian neighbors. None of you have any Persian neighbors. You may have some people from Iran, but they really aren't the Persians of old. You don't have any Persian neighbors. These are nations that have fallen, been destroyed. And we find that destruction early on in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah 63, when we talk about a wine vat. There's a wine vat. And every nation has a wine vat. And there's a wine vat for this country. And on the side of the wine vat is United States of America. And it is being filled with grapes, or really it's being filled with the sins of the nation. And God is waiting until it is completely full, and then he gets into the wine vat and tramples out the grapes. It's really noted in detail in Isaiah 63, and then when we get into the Revelation, it's noted again. There was a wine vat for the nation of the Roman Empire. And so those nations are gone. You may have some Italians living in the neighborhood, but they're not Romans. The Romans were actually 35 gens. Gens is the Latin word that we get genealogy from. And there were 35 gens, and those were the 35 original families of Rome. They considered themselves Roman. All the rest of the people were just considered Italians. So there was a great conflict in the Roman Empire between who's a Roman and who's an Italian. And the Italians were usually misused, and it was a very difficult, a little bit more difficult life for them. And there were attempts to bring Italians, especially as the legions ran out of legionaries. The Roman soldiers called a legionaries, not called a legionnaire. That's the French Foreign Legion. This is a legionary, and that's the foot soldier in the Roman Empire. And eventually they started running out of soldiers, and so they decided, well, where are we going to get more soldiers, more legionaries? And they started making covenants with the Italian people and elevating them to a position where they could take their young men and put them into military service. Some of that all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Yeah. So here we have this great statue. It's a great statue that is going to be noted. Let me just note the introduction here. The name Daniel means God is my judge. He was probably of royal seed. He goes off in the first deportation of 606 BC. He's carried off into Babylonian captivity. By strict definition, he was a different kind of prophet. He's really noted in the Hebrew Bible as a prophet, but he's more of an ambassador. He's there in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. He's still around in the court of Belshazzar, the one who sees the handwriting on the wall. And Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, is really the king at the time, but he's off in different parts of the country doing different things in noting one of his gods that he worshiped. But Nabonidus is the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar through Belshazzar, and then that's the end of the Babylonian Empire. And then Cyrus the Great is the Persian who comes to power 539 and writes an edict allowing the Jews to go back into the Promised Land in right around 536. 536 is the time period. If you count from 606 to 536, you end up with the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. And it's in Daniel, the 9th chapter. We'll take a look at that. We'll get to there eventually. We'll take a look at that in Daniel, the 9th chapter. Daniel starts out praying to God, and he has a beautiful prayer there in chapter 9. And all he's asking is one question: isn't it time to go back? And God doesn't answer that directly. God just provides him with some information that is absolutely fantastic, which leads us to believe, and it's true, that when you ask God for something, more than likely he's going to give you a lot more than what you asked for. And that's just beautifully noted there in Daniel chapter 9. So he's a little bit of a different kind of prophet than all the other prophets. This is just a map of ancient Mesopotamia. You can see the Tigris and Euphrates flowing down into the Persian Gulf. And this is just the time of Hammurabi. The old Babylonian Empire is the Empire of Hammurabi, and that predates the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar is actually more easily referred to as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The old Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi, that's what it would have looked like in the area that it would have conquered. And the Casites are a people who come in, and this is not unusual. Late Bronze Age, there was a lot of turmoil in the late Bronze Age. And in the late Bronze Age, a sea people came in and tried to conquer Egypt. They end up being the Philistines. And they're a very warlike people, and so the Casites were the same, but at an earlier time. These are Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar's route of march as they came into the land to conquer the land. The northern kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes in the north, had already gone off into Assyrian captivity, and that'd be around 721, 722 BC. And now we're down to 606, and this is when Daniel goes off in the deportations. 3 deportations, one 606, where Daniel goes off, one in 597, where Ezekiel goes off. Ezekiel ends up by the river Chebar, you remember, with the people in captivity. And then Jeremiah stays in Jerusalem, and that would be the last deportation. He doesn't leave in a deportation, and he eventually ends up going to Egypt, and then that's the last we hear of Jeremiah. So 3 deportations, 606, 597, 586 are the 3 deportations. Second half of the writing, Daniel's name is the one who received the revelation, chapter 7, verses 2, 6, and 28. That's important because liberal scholarship wants to take away the latter half of the writing and say no one could have known, living at the time Daniel supposedly lived, no one could have known all this fantastically correct information, especially in Daniel chapter 11, that deals with the Greek period. Well, Daniel knew it, and the reason Daniel knew it is because God revealed it to him. He wrote it down. That's how that all happened. But liberal scholarship doesn't want anything that sounds like the miraculous. So they want you to put another writer in there who takes the name of Daniel, which is not unusual with a number of writings that are found, especially writings that are found between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that are called pseudepigraphical writings. And pseudepigraphic writing is where someone says, I'm going to write something, and I want people to read it, so I'm not going to say I wrote it, I'm going to say Solomon wrote it. And so there's a fair number of uninspired writings that are pseudepigraphic, that are like that. And so liberal scholarship says, really that's what happened. That's not really Daniel. But the entire writing is seen to be the work of one author by its unity, no doubt about that. And when you look at Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus talks about the writing of Daniel. Remember, Matthew 24 is the destruction of Jerusalem. And there's a phrase in that destruction of Jerusalem that's called the abomination of desolation. And Jesus refers to it and says Daniel wrote that down. Now, here you got it. Liberal scholarship, Jesus. Balance bar. Which one you going to believe? Well, I'll take Jesus any day and every day. And so the whole writing is written by Daniel. He's been given that information. 2 possible dates are suggested. The liberal date is 175 to 165. Conservative date is 606 to 536, and that's the one that, if you don't have that on your test paper when I test you on it, then that's a wrong answer. So there it is, the conservative date, 606 to 536 BC. And by the way, Daniel goes into captivity as a youth, and we're not sure, somewhere between 16 to 18 years of age, more than likely. And he's still around at 536 because in Daniel 9 he's writing this all down in his prayer to God. Isn't it time for us to go back? And of course it would be time to go back. Reasons that are given for rejection of the late date, we're just not going to go into that. But the theme is God rules the nations. Now, if you want to know what Babylon looked like, that's, if you can see that up on the screen, that's a pretty good rendition of what the city of Babylon looked like. You can see an inner wall that has a moat right there where the river runs through the city, and that's a part of the natural defense of the city. And then there's an outer wall there, and Herodotus, who is an ancient historian, tells us all sorts of things about the city. And when you read him, you're sort of left with the idea that, man, this is a great, huge city. I'll show you how big it is here in a minute. And this is what it would look like with the river running through it. The city is comprised and built mostly of kiln-fired bricks. Kiln-fired, not sun-hardened clay, but kiln-fired bricks, where the brick would be extremely strong. And in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the bricks were produced many times with different colored glazes, and blue and yellow, or blue and gold, a number of different colors, especially for the Ishtar Gate. I'll show you the Ishtar Gate here in just a moment. But virtually all of these glazed bricks that have been found by archaeologists have Nebuchadnezzar's name stamped in the back of them. He wanted to make sure everybody remembered who he was. And there's the Ishtar Gate right there. And the Ishtar Gate is made, these blue and silver and gold bricks, many times yellow bricks, and all of the government buildings. That doesn't mean the people lived in houses like this, but all the wealthy people did. And Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild all of this to restore the glory of Iraq to its former glory, and he was hanged as a result of all that. There's Ishtar Gate again. Now this is a modern day map, and right here inside the big square is a smaller square, and that really represents the walls of Babylon. This is Lakewood, Colorado. And the Bear Valley building is right down here in the southern part of it. There's West Hamden right here, and Mississippi up at the top, and right within that block you could fit. There's Littleton, Englewood, Denver. You could fit the city of Babylon. So we get to thinking sometimes, man, these cities are fantastically huge. No, they weren't. And the reason they weren't is that they just didn't have the ability to take care of that many people within a confined area. And that's what this city would look like with the river running through it. And certainly it was a beautiful place when it was existent. The purpose of the writing, primary purpose of Daniel was and is to show the sovereignty of God in dealing with nations and kingdoms. The predicted purpose was to clearly set forth the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. This is an artist's rendition of what the sacking of the city by the Babylonians probably looked like. And they had siege machinery. The Assyrians are really almost kissing cousins of the Babylonians, and so a lot of what the Assyrians had, the Babylonians adopted, and so all of the siege machinery that was used by the Assyrians was siege machinery used by the Babylonians. That's about what Nebuchadnezzar would look like. We have enough funerary items to note what even the coloration of the clothing that was worn by the wealthy people. This is, let me go back here. lots of purple used there would be coming into Babylon through the Ishtar gate. This is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This is just from descriptive history that we know about it. You can see waterfalls in the area there, and it is built like a ziggurat, and ziggurat would be an Assyrian Babylonian pyramid, just built in stages, not covered over as the pyramids. In their original form were all of those areas where you can climb up on the pyramid were there, but they were all covered by a covering, a sheeting of plaster. But that's all disappeared with time. But the ziggurat didn't have any sheeting or any covering, and the water was pumped up. They knew about hydraulic pumps. They were mostly made out of rawhide. The metallurgy didn't allow them to get that far in the pumps, but these are hand-driven pumps. They pump water out of the water down below up into the top, and then it would flow down. And this was done by Nebuchadnezzar for one of his wives who pined for her former land in which she lived. And this was just to get her in a good mood. We have no idea, archaeologists have no idea where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were located. Some think they were located in Babylon, and the city of Babylon, and some think it's a different city. No one really knows. There's just really nothing that remains other than just a written document concerning the Hanging Garden. So 6 historical events in the life of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6. Daniel is raised to prominence in chapter 1, verses 1 through 21. The expedition of Nebuchadnezzar against Jerusalem. If you turn back to chapter 1 and take a look at verse 1. In the 3rd year, that's going to be 606 BC. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar. Shinar is really almost a word that the Jewish people didn't like to use, because it is a place where idolatry has its foundation in the mind of the Jewish community. It is the city of Babylon. So it brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And that's just hard for the Jewish writer, Daniel right here, to even write that down, because that's just absolutely disgusting that would happen. But it did. And so exiled Daniel and his companions introduced to the king's court, verses 3 through 7. And we're not going to go through this. You've gone through this before in your studies of Daniel. And this is a pretty good rendition of what the throne room scene probably looked like. You can see that wall of glazed brick right there, how ornate it was, and that would be pretty accurate rendition. You can see that you've got 4 guards there dressed in black on either side of the 4, and so you've got the 3 friends of Daniel and Daniel himself before Nebuchadnezzar, and this is going to be the time that Daniel and the 3 friends are pressed into service. You remember that they did not eat the food that was originally designed for them. Daniel said, we've got 10 days, give us 10 days where we can eat our food, and we'll see if we look any better than the rest are eating the king's food. And it seemed like to the one who was testing them that they looked better, and so when they're presented before Nebuchadnezzar, he chooses them just right away. They look good and all of that. And that was all in chapter 1. And you can see perhaps maybe the food that was presented to them. It doesn't go into much detail concerning the food. Of course, all food as we would note. I think I'm going to have to try this. So, dream image of Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 2, verses 1 through 49. Dream troubles King Nebuchadnezzar, 1 through 16. Daniel's petition and praise to the providing God. We looked at that. And that's Nebuchadnezzar rolling around on the bed at night, not getting any sleep. And what he's dreaming is this statue. So looking at chapter 2, look at verse 31 of chapter 2. You, O king, were looking, behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue, let me go back here. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. So you continued looking till a stone was cut out without hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed. So this whole statue is destroyed. All at the same time became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. Wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was a dream. And you can imagine Nebuchadnezzar, he's just jumping up and down with joy because it's the dream. Very obviously, this individual knows. And we shall tell its interpretation before the king. He still included the 3 friends right there. We have come as a group, and he has already said that this is by no earthly power that he's able to do this. He gives glory to God. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to note that as we finish this up. So, interpretation. Verse 37. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he's given them into your hand. This is God's control of the nation, God's beneficent move, and has caused you to rule over them. You're the head of gold. After you, there will arise another kingdom inferior to you. That's it. That's all he says right here. I want you to note this, because if you go through this very quickly, you don't pick this up. He doesn't say anything about the Persians. What does he say about the Persians? Another kingdom inferior to you. That's it. Then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. That's all he says about that kingdom. Now, there in verse 39, the inferior kingdom is Medo-Persia of Cyrus the Great. Then the third kingdom is the Grecian kingdom of Alexander the Great, which will rule over the whole earth. And that's all that's said. So he has said a little bit about the Babylonians, very little about the Persians, very little about the Greeks. And the reason for that is, look what he says about this fourth kingdom. Verse 40. And there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. Now, just keep in mind, the Babylonians were taken over by the Persians. The Persians were taken over by the Greeks. The Greeks were taken over by the Romans. So, it will break in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It would be a divided kingdom, and it was very divided. But it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron, partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. When you're looking at the Roman Empire, you're looking at a kingdom that is strong in one way and it's weak in another way. And this is a perfect description of the fragile nature of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire went out and conquered all of the land that had been conquered earlier by the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks, but they just didn't have the manpower to control all of that. And so they established a setup of client kings. And a client king is an example given to us by Herod the Great. Herod the Great is an Idumean. He's an Edomite. He's not even a Jew. He's a proselyte because the Jews accept him as a proselyte, but he's an Edomite. But he is one who was powerful in the land, and so the Romans tapped him on the shoulder and said, we'd like you to be king of this area, and this will be your duty. This is what you'll have to do. You'll have to be a tax collector. You'll have to pay tax, and you'll have to administer this, and there'll be a military presence and all of this. And that way they didn't have to put a legion in every, or 2 legions or 3 legions in every territory that they conquered. They had these client kings. Now the weakness of the client king is that the client king learns all about the tactics of the Roman Empire and the army of the Roman Empire and the legions and how the legions are equipped and the weapons and all of that. And after a while, they become so powerful that they say, why are we still paying money off to Rome? Let's just take our land back. There's your weakness right there. There's the iron and the clay. Now look at how much time is being spent on this. I mean, we didn't get any time at all with the Persians and the Greeks, and we got all this information. Verse 43, in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will continue combined with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. This is a 5th notation for a kingdom. But this is an important kingdom. A kingdom which will never be destroyed. That kingdom will not be left for another people. What does it mean, not left for another people? Well, the Babylonians were left for the Persians. The Persians were left for the Greeks. The Greeks were left for the Romans. Not so with this kingdom. When that 4th kingdom goes down, we're going to see what this kingdom will be like. It's talking about the church right here in verse 44. Not being left for another people, it will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever, inasmuch you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future, so the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, and he falls on his face in the presence of Daniel. Very, very unusual. Kings like Nebuchadnezzar don't do those things. Did homage to Daniel, gave orders to present to him an offering of fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods. This is the beginning of a faith build-up on the part of Nebuchadnezzar. And when we finally leave Nebuchadnezzar at the last here in the book of Daniel, we may be almost assured that when we get into that heavenly scene, we may find Brother Nebuchadnezzar, because his faith really starts building up in this contact with Daniel. Surely your God is a God of gods, a Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries. Since you have been able to reveal this mystery, then the king promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made request of the king and appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, now you've got your Babylonian names, over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. And so you have probably read that before. That's all pretty easy to understand. It raises Daniel to a position of prominence. So Daniel's reliance upon God in the interpretation in verses 24 through 45. Daniel's God is praised by King Nebuchadnezzar, verses 46 through 49. And then when you come over to chapter 3, again, one of the accounts that we always teach our kids in Bible class, and this would be the fiery furnace. Now the fiery furnace is going to be noted because there are different methods of capital punishment in these nations. With the Persians, it is either a lion's den as capital punishment, or it is a hanging, and sometimes the hanging involves impalement, where a stake is driven into the stomach area and the person is dropped over that pointed stake, and that was the method of killing that individual. When you're looking at the Babylonians, since the Babylonians have at their beck and call these kilns that are used to fire these bricks up, a fiery furnace is one of the methods of capital punishment. So it's not surprising when we come down to chapter 3 and we're looking at the three friends who will not, at the sound of all sorts of music, bow to an image that has been set up on a plain area, and so they're cast into the fiery furnace, and we'll just come back and note a little bit of that and be able to move on. Anyone have any questions or any thoughts before we take a 10-minute break or so?
When Daniel speaks of Daniel being well educated in language and science and things like, is that a divine gift?
Yeah, some of it's divine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when he went in captivity, he also was.
He was also well educated.
Okay.
Yeah, the thought is that he's probably of royal seed within that family of royalty, and they would all be well educated.
Okay.
Yeah, only the rich people were educated generally. And only within the Jewish community, only boys were educated generally. Yeah. Girls were taught by their mothers to be good wives and homemakers. Anyone else? Okay, take about a 10-minute break.